Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to episode 3 of the Street Dog podcast. And this episode is called The Grand Moviegame Conspiracy. And of course, I am joined to break down this conspiracy with Dynamo. What's up, dude?
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Movies Pretending to be Games. Bad movies pretending to be games, in fact. And we'll be talking about a bit of this.
Yeah.
So, which games have you played recently that really demonstrate how some people think that they should make movies, but they don't want to make movies, so they make games, but they end up making neither. They just end up making things that cannot really be described as games, but cannot really be described as movies either. So
it's interactive software in air quotes. I would say... Actually, but I mean, obviously, people who have been following the channel are going to say Dead Space 2 fits this bill because that's the game that I most recently streamed. But prior to that and alongside that, I've also been playing some games with my brother just offline. And the two games that I played there were Sniper Elite 4 and Far Cry 5. And I should note that I have never played Sniper Elite 1, 2, or 3, and I have never played Far Cry 1, 2, 3, or 4. So this was my introduction to both of these franchises. And I always sort of regarded the Sniper Elite franchise as a bit of a meme in that it seemed very like her definition, where it's like it's trying to be filmic. It's almost like you go into this game knowing that they are trying to be cinematic, which is sort of the plague that we talked about and we hinted at, that you mentioned, Dynamo, at the beginning here, where it's people who are trying to make movies or trying to make something other than games using games as their medium. And that's essentially what I would like to describe Sniper Elite 4 as. Because the main calling card of the whole, like, of playing the game in the first place is this, like, weird shock value gore stuff where they have these kill cams where you land a sniper rifle shot on somebody, it, like, for a brief second, like slow-mos, snaps you over to them and shows you their demise in gruesome detail. Except, of course, no 3D game ever looks good. So this is a case where it doesn't really... if you have a trained eye, it's not very impressive. I'll put it to you that way. So given that that's the case, we're then stuck in an unfortunate situation where if you leave these on, and thankfully they are toggleable, you're just getting your gameplay and camera roughly yanked away from you for split seconds every now and then, which is very similar to like Doom 2016 and other cinematic games, where you just don't have the ability to withstand a significant amount of time without having your gameplay loop dramatically change. And we talked about a bit about this, I think, throughout not just this podcast so far, but also other podcasts. It's a situation where if you don't have a layer of consistency, certain level of synchronicity between the player and the systems that the player is interacting with, you're essentially making a lot of the experiences they have invalid, where it doesn't matter if you learned really well how to handle a certain mechanic if it just changes. That's why gimmicks are bad, for example. So like that's like a general rule. The problem with like roughly intercepting the pacing is very similar, and actually something very similar happens in Far Cry 5. So in Far Cry 5, you have this story mode thing that we just skipped all the cutscenes because we don't really care about story in video games anyway, and I can't say that much about the story beyond the fact that the only way to actually soak it in, generally speaking, like the predominant way that they are force feeding you the story, well, I sort of gave it away there. It's force feeding you. So you have these random cutscenes that will take a fairly long amount of time and actually essentially encourage you to skip because you don't want to be sitting there doing nothing, especially if you think to like anybody who has a limited amount of time to play video games. Like I technically don't have a very limited amount of time, but because I'm doing so much other shit, I would much rather just play a game instead of watch a game, if that makes any sense. And so of course I'm going to be more focused on like trying to just enjoy the hour that I've allotted myself to play a video game instead of having to watch a cutscene for it. And that is one of the main areas where Far Cry 5 falls apart, because not only does it have random cutscenes or just gratuitous cutscenes in terms of their length and especially the onboarding time, like the opening hour of the game is ridiculous. But the main issue comes from the fact that at random points of progress throughout the game, you will randomly be yanked away to another story mission, and you don't get to opt in or out of this situation. So they do it in really ham-fisted ways. Like one time I was in a plane flying around, and they apparently hit me with a blow dart that knocked me out. But I was in the fucking sky in a plane. So, I mean, if anything, I would have just died crashing if they had managed to successfully hit that shot. So, like, that's a case where they obviously didn't even care what the player might be doing. They didn't bother, like, accounting for any potential situations like that. Like, I have to land the plane eventually, so they could have just done it there, although that still would have been kind of annoying. But the idea that they don't even try to maintain any degree of sense making there is pretty telling, I think. And this is an area I'm actually not super well versed in. I haven't experienced too many games that actually just blatantly stop you from whatever you were doing, particularly open world games like this that are sort of meant to be like, the whole conceit of an open world game is we're going to have less individual details because we have to account for so many different possibilities, but you have all of those options and possibilities, and so you get to sort of choose your own way to experience the game and to carve your own path in the world. It never amounts to that, but that's sort of the idea that they're trying to sell you on when a game developer or a publisher is trying to sell you on an open world game. It's like, you can explore this world. Well, in Far Cry 5, if you've explored the world in this exact same ways that I did, or anywhere similar, where you're actually accomplishing some side missions and stuff, eventually you'll earn enough points towards the main story that you'll just randomly be yanked into another mission and be told you can't explore the world until you finish this mission. So I'm not sure if you've ever had experiences similar to this. From what I know, you haven't played too many open world games anyway, Dynamo, but I am curious as to if this makes you think of any other games, either the Far Cry 5 example or the really her definition cinematic stuff from Sniper Elite 4.
Well, my experience with open world games is mostly limited to the old ones, like the early Grand Theft Auto games, for example, or the Saints Row games.
Right.
And I haven't really played that many otherwise. I felt like I did play some, but some of them, like, they were open world, but they may as well not have been. Like, I think a game like that I can think of is Rise of the Tomb Raider, I believe. I played a bit of that, and it was technically open world, but besides just hunting for fucking collectibles, it may as well have been a linear game otherwise.
Right.
But yeah, like, I believe the main issue with open world games historically is that many of them, obviously, like you said, had technological constraints, so they could not really afford to be as polished or performant as linear games. They needed to, showcase so much of the game world all at once, for example, or stuff like that. I mean, I don't know if people here are familiar with the early GTA games, but a very easy example is actually GTA Vice City versus GTA San Andreas, where San Andreas came out later, like I think a few years later, but it actually looks much worse than Vice City did because the map is much bigger. So
Right.
Apparently they had to really cut down on the graphics quality in order to make the game run acceptably well. Now, when it comes to design, I think really the main issue, I think the issue is that it's a problem of conflict, like a problem of different approaches basically not working together very well. They want to have a game that's cinematic and quote-unquote movie-like. That's what the GTA games are like, for example. But at the same time, they also want to have a game where you can basically do whatever the fuck you want, and a game that doesn't really behave in a realistic or even movie-like fashion, because you just go... Like, I don't know if you've seen clips of Just Cause 2, for example, or even some of the GTA 5 stuff.
I've played a bit of Just Cause 2, so I know what you're talking about.
It's just madness, completely incoherent madness. And, I mean, I don't necessarily have anything against that, but obviously it definitely goes against many of the other core concepts of the game, right? Where you have a quote-unquote realistic, believable missions, at least on the surface, and then in the unrestricted the gameplay of the open world, you just have incoherent madness everywhere. I mean, I feel like they often try to merge these two aspects of the game together, and they do not succeed at that. Your example that you gave just then about Far Cry wanting to stun the player while he was on a plane, I didn't even really understand what was going on there. I'll probably have to watch a video clip of that. I thought it was a cutscene at first, but apparently they just shot you with a specific weapon, and they did not.
Well, they didn't really shoot you. You just hear an audio cue of a blow dart, and then you go unconscious and wake up in some other area. But I happened to be in a plane during that moment after finishing another mission, and that finishing the mission triggered the sequence where I got blow darted. But I was just wasn't in the middle of a cutscene. I was just hanging, playing the game. So like that's a very extreme example, I guess.
Yeah, that's basically a bug.
I would assume so. Yeah, that's how I would interpret it.
Yeah, and when it comes to open world games, again, like probably the best examples I can think of, you actually asked about restricted map access. This is something that the early 3D GTA games did, all of them, as far as I know. San Andreas, Vice City, and GTA 3, they all prevent you from accessing certain areas of the map before the story allows you to do that. And it's always because of fucking retarded reasons, like, there's a storm going by that has destroyed the bridge, so you cannot actually cross. Even though there's literally an invisible wall that you cannot cross, even if you have a plane. So it's just, again, it stems from the fact that they try to mix a story-oriented game in an open-world game that's all about chaos and being able to do whatever the fuck you want. In that sense, I think the best two examples I can think of for games that actually maybe did not do it perfectly, but at least were more competently or coherent in this sense were the Saints Row games, at least the first two, because as far as I know, they don't have any restrictions as to where you can go. Like from the very first start of the game, you can just go wherever you want. And you can also play many of the missions in the order you prefer. So it definitely feels like it's way more coherent with what it tries to be. It also kind of embraces the madness aspect a little bit more, in that it doesn't really try to have a super serious storyline. The missions and the activities, which is some of the mini games you can do, are pretty much batshit insane, just as the general gameplay in the open world aspect is. And GTA 2 is another game that also did that. I mean, GTA 2 does have some restricted areas, but it's more like different cities or city sections that you can visit after you've completed one. So it's basically different worlds, essentially. Like it's not like a place you can reach on foot or in a car. You need to just basically start a new game and go to a different world. So at least it's a little bit more believable. I don't know how to call it. I mean, those are the only examples I can think of open world games that sort of did it right, or at least didn't fail as miserably as some of the games I talked about, and Far Cry as well, from what you've told me.
Yeah.
And about Far Cry for Sniper Elite, actually, I want to mention this. The only thing I know about Sniper Elite in particular is that it's a game infamous for having the ball busting mechanic, I think, where you basically shoot people in the genitals. Like, that's literally the only thing I've ever seen of the game.
Yeah, and there's also apparently some really psychotic, esoteric Easter egg where when you can kill Hitler in Sniper Elite 4, and if you shoot him in the testicles, sometimes it will say like testicles shot, and sometimes it will say testicle shot singular, and depending on that, you're supposed to intuit that means that it was a decoy because the real Hitler only had one ball or something. So they I don't know why they spend so much fucking detail on that one thing. I don't actually know all of the specifics. I might be getting something wrong there. If somebody has played it and they want to, shed some light in the comment section.
Yeah, holy shit. I mean, like, as far as I knew, it was Francisco Franco that had one testicle, not Hitler, but I don't know.
Yeah, maybe I'm not a historical testicle expert, so I can't say. Yeah. But like, I don't know why that of all things is their focus. You know what I mean? Like, I don't get that at all. So yeah, there's definitely some questionable influences, shall we say, when it comes to that.
And when it comes to Far Cry, I believe the first 3 games received praise at the time, but I've never really heard anything about the sequels after that at all. Actually, I've heard something about, I think it was called Iron Dragon or something like that. Hold on, let me... Far Cry Dragon? Far Cry Blood Dragon.
Blood Dragon, okay. Yeah, I think that was the DLC for the 4th game or something.
I think it was a standalone game. And it was basically based off the engine of the 3rd game. But yeah, that's the last Far Cry I heard anything positive about. After that, people apparently just stopped pretending it existed. Well, not everyone, I guess. I guess your brother still noticed and made you play it.
Yeah, we did have an amazing experience in the opening of the 5th game. Our first time playing it, I think within the first hour, we had an insane physics bug happen where a moose got hit by a Mack truck, a really large shipping truck, and I killed the driver of the Mack truck, and the Mack truck started spinning in circles like it was nothing, like it was paperweight or something, like it was really tiny. except it's a giant Mack truck. And the reason for it was because the moose also died on contact when the Mack truck hit it, and then its corpse tried to like ragdoll or something. So basically, by virtue of that and the driver dying at the same time because I killed him, that game is a weird mechanic where anytime you kill somebody, they're ejected from the driver's seat or whatever seat they're sitting in. So they like it even opens the door and everything, and they fall out. I don't know why that always happens, but
that's weird.
It 100% of the time, if you shoot somebody, they fall out of wherever they are inside the vehicle. And so I think by like virtue of multiple ragdolls interacting with the Mack truck, it must have started spinning. Maybe it got caught on a tree or something too, but it was really psychotic. I wish I had that captured. Instead, I managed to put a clip of some of the incredible gameplay that you can experience. That's in the Not Gay Enough channel. It should still be there, actually, if you want to pull that up while we're sitting here talking. It's a clip of where it's a clip below the liquidation clip, so it was a while ago, so you might have to scroll up a little bit, but it's there. There's a helicopter, and it's great. Where we found a helicopter just sitting in the middle of nowhere. That it was actually part of a quest. We had to destroy it, and we couldn't find it, and then we found it in the fucking woods.
Wait, sorry, what is this?
In the Not Gay Enough channel.
Oh,
here, I can just send you the link, as I saw it earlier.
Oh, spinning forever, is that it?
Yeah.
Let me check.
I'll have to throw that in the description for you guys to listen or watch along. It's only like 30 seconds. And then I thought my brother killed him, but apparently he didn't. The man just expired because my brother was getting attacked by a cougar and I didn't kill him. So that's like another layer of insanity.
Yeah, that's...
So that's just like some
of
the experience.
Excellent display of physics.
Yeah.
It reminds me of some of the stuff that happens in Just Cause 2. I guess technology has not really improved much since then.
Yeah, Just Cause 2 is like an example of a game where the whole point of the game is basically just batshit insanity. You know, it's like bedlam and chaos. Like that's what you want out of a game like that. And it sort of does it, like it does it in an okay way, but it always feels like the later Saints Row games as well had this problem. 3 and 4, I don't know if they've made any others, but Saints Row 3 and 4 had issues where basically they almost like embraced being lazy, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
It was like they embraced the fact that their engine was busted.
I think Saints Row 3 and 4 are terrible games, in my opinion.
Yeah. Well, they're basically like, it's like they have these crazy premises, and the reason for you to play it is because, it's wacky and adventurous, and it doesn't take itself seriously. That's cool. Especially in the modern era, like most games do take themselves seriously. So it's nice to have that as a variety. But the problem with fucking Saints Row, they're all the same. The problem with it is that it's like you're basically in a situation where you're playing a game that acknowledges that it's terrible, and that's supposed to make it good somehow, like in an ironic hipster sense or something. I don't know, but that's basically it. Like they recognize that they are bad, and they have embraced it instead of actually trying to make something higher quality. Like instead of aspiring to something greater, they've basically just settled for drudgery.
They're basically a bastardization of the first two games, really. Like the first two games were also wacky, but they were way more tasteful in a sense. Like they didn't really pretend to be as retarded as the later two games were, where it's just what the fuck is going on most of the time. Like there's humor, and then there's just basically nonsense that you just put there for the sake of it being there, and you just think about a random thing and you place it there.
Yeah.
Like I don't know, an even more extreme version of math crap. I don't even know how to call it. Like no method in the madness, basically.
Yeah.
That's
a good way to describe it. It's like it's tapping into that like really annoying trend that you get over. It's like a phase you get into when you're young, where it's like things are random and that makes them funny. You know, it's like, it's literally the LOL so random XD trope or whatever, where it's like when you're a kid and some random shit happens, that's hilarious. But as you grow as an individual, you'd start to realize, oh, maybe there's more to humor than random slapstick stuff. And
basically.
Yeah. I don't know. I would actually liken like the Saints Row 3 and 4 as it's similar to some of those really, really bad comedies that have come out in film recently, where it's like, well, I say recently, but it's like in the past like 20 years in general, like a lot of the comedies have been all style over substance, if you can even call it style, when they They just do the slapstick humor shit. And it's like the Adam Sandler comedies. If you've seen any of his films, it's very similar. Where they basically, there's not really that much higher thought going on, and it's fine to not trade in heavy thoughts or heavy concepts. You don't have to do that with every film or game or whatever, but your jokes should actually be jokes instead of offensive lines or like whatever the case may be. Like if there's a constructional element to a joke, then it's instantly more, I guess, thought-provoking than when you just have random shit happen, or when like this person is made fun of, but it's like just a name calling or something instead of an actual joke where it's like, you know, leveraging something you know about the character that requires you to know about the character in the first place in order for the joke to make sense. Like there's so many steps that are just missed in those comedy movies that I feel like it's very similar to the Saints Row stuff where, like you said, it's like, I've come up with this idea, get it in the game. And I don't know. That's like the chaotic evil of games, I guess.
Yeah. And I mean, since we're talking about Saints Row, I may as well talk a little bit about my history with the games and what I think about the. I've played the first 4 games. I think they made a few more after that, but I haven't played them. So I might as well just get a little bit into it, since I think it also suffers from the problem that you described anyway. So I don't know if the viewers of the channel are familiar at all with GTA 2, which is probably the most well-known game before the 3D era of GTA. Like, it had a top-down 2D perspective, and it had very different gameplay and progression from the follow-up games, in that you don't basically have a linear story that you follow. Instead, you have to work for a series of gangs and do a series of missions in the order you want. And you don't even have to do them all. The only objective in the game is to get a score high enough so that you can go to the next world, which is more like an arcade game, I guess. And Saints Row is a little bit more similar to the 2D GTA games like GTA 2 than it is to the 3D games, because just like GTA 2, there are 3 gangs that you don't work for them, but you work against them. That's the main difference. But you also do the missions like out of order, in that you don't have to do the missions for this gang before you do the missions for the other gang. You can do them all in the order you want, just like GTA 2. It also has a similar respect meter where it influences your ability to play the missions. And overall, the structure is somewhat like a cross between the 2D and 3D GTA games, and I felt like they accomplished it in a way that was much more coherent and well done compared to the 3D GTA games that actually came out. Now, the main differences in the in the Saints Row 3 and 4 games is that they basically completely changed the way the game works. First of all, they made the respect meter into some sort of RPG-esque mechanic, where you basically need respect in order to unlock abilities, in order to sprint faster or have more health or whatever. And some of the mini games that you do, I don't know if you remember, there was trafficking or helicopter sniping missions and stuff like that. It's not really storyline missions; it's mostly stuff you do on the side. Well, those were also in the first 2 games, but they were more well done there, I felt. The problem is that in order to do some of the harder mini games in Saints Row 3, for example, I felt like you pretty much need to have the respect fueled upgrades. Like, in order to do the harder trafficking missions, you need to have the faster regenerating health or the faster sprinting. Otherwise, you just get destroyed because the game is just unbalanced that way. It basically expects that you have the abilities that you unlock through respect in order to be able to do them. I think this is I don't know if I'm making it clear. I don't know if you're actually remembering what I'm talking about here, but I think that this is a key example of a game that basically lies about its own approach of it being open world. Because if some activities expect you to have certain abilities before you can do them, even though they're unlocked to you from the beginning, they're not really they may as well not be, right? They're not actually meant to be played whenever you want. They're meant to be playing whenever the developers expect that you want to play them, right?
Yeah.
It's not really a true freedom of open world. Whereas at least in the first game, you can pretty much do all the activities before you do a single one of the campaign missions. So at least in the first 2 games, it was much more coherent with what they wanted to do. So I felt like the third game basically added this RPG aspect where you need respect in order to unlock abilities, whereas in the first two games, abilities were simply unlocked by beating the minigames themselves. So you didn't really have a RPG mode at all. There were no RPG elements. And like I said, you could do anything you wanted in the order you wanted. Whereas Saints Row 3 even has a linear campaign, really. Like, you don't really have... like, you do have 3 gangs that you fight against, but the campaign is actually linear. Like, you just fight them in whatever story-oriented approach you want to have. And the missions themselves are actually... Like I said, this is why the game also suffers from the same issue of it being like a movie, where many of the missions are basically just walking simulators. I remember there was a mission where you need to dress up as the enemy commander. I think it was Cyrus Temple. Like the guy who was the fucking sci-fi army that goes after you. I don't know if you remember any of this. And
Vaguely,
you basically just have to...
but I know that there were a ton of missions that were like what you're describing, where it's very much like... It's almost like, despite the fact that the story is wacky, you have a situation where the expectation is that you'll still take it seriously enough to play through walking simulator type maps or whatever.
Exactly. And the first 2 games were not quite as wacky, but they had no walking simulator missions at all.
No.
Apart from just driving from point A to point B sometimes. But even then, you were usually under attack by enemies. So, like, the game basically is wacky on the surface, but in terms of gameplay, it's much more formulaic and much more limited compared to the previous titles. So it's kind of a paradox where the game sells itself as an open world wacky game, but in reality, it's just a shallow, mostly linear game that shouldn't even be open world. Like, it's just like, I don't know. Again, I don't know if people have played this game, but I think if they have, they'll know what I'm talking about. Where the mission design is just such a downgrade, and overall, the experience really doesn't feel like it belongs in an open world game. Like, even the city itself, like in Saints Row 2, there's all sorts of weird animations and shit that happens if you just walk around the city. Like, you can just see stuff happens everywhere, whereas the city in Saints Row 3 feels extremely static, where basically there's nothing unique about any aspect of the city whatsoever. There's not really much fun to be had in just exploring it. I mean, the game doesn't even have a fucking day to night transition cycle. Like, the time of the day just changes whenever you enter a mission, literally.
Oh,
which is so fucking weird.
That must be very jarring.
Yeah. It again reinforces how it doesn't really feel like they wanted you to play in the open world for extended periods of time. They just wanted you to play through the missions in a linear fashion, essentially.
Yeah. Oh, well, one of the things that we can talk about in general, since we have decided to talk a bit about open world stuff anyway, is we can reference the fact that we're dealing with games here that don't really have a large portion of their expectations for how you consume the story or how you enjoy the story, how you experience their narrative. It doesn't come from exploration and taking stock of what's happening in your surroundings and responding to dynamic events. There's a few things like that, and I think every open world game now, like Far Cry 5 will have random shit that will come in, like you'll be driving down the road and you'll see some civilian getting chased by a cultist, or you'll see like a truck where they've captured some people and you can free them if you kill the driver and unlock the back of the truck or something like that. Like, there's some events that I would really hesitate to call them dynamic, but
they're just scripted, basically.
They're not real. I mean, they can happen pretty much anywhere. So, like, by definition, they are dynamic. But because you resolve them so instantaneously, it doesn't really feel like anything other than a quick chore. It doesn't feel like there's really that much of an accomplishment. Now, what this does do is it forwards the progress bar a little bit closer to the end, where once you do that for all 3 zones, for each of those zones that you do it, you unlock a boss battle, basically. And there's breakpoints during that, which progress story missions towards killing the boss, the cult leader in that area. So it's very formulaic, like you were saying earlier, where you essentially have a linear series of missions that you can't be subverted. That order cannot be mixed around or messed around with. It has to be done in the linear fashion. And the only real open world aspect of it comes from the perspective of how you attain the points that then yank you into those forced missions that are just by definition linear. And it's not like you can just choose to try to take on the head honcho cultist as soon as you walk into the area. You can't find them. You can't go and attack them. It would be one thing if you could, and if you were skilled enough, you could actually eliminate the cult leader in that area. And then they could figure out what else you could do in that area afterwards. Because it's not like all of the other side missions or anything like that disappear once the cult leader's dead. It just means that, like, I guess some dialogue has to change or whatever, so they stop referencing the cult leader as the source of their problems. But, like, there's pretty much it. So I just don't understand why they went for the route that they did, when if you really wanted it to be an open world game, just by definition, like, you have to be able to engage with the game's narrative in completely different avenues. And you have to be able to look at it and really, like, decide as a player how you want to handle certain things. And there could be some element of, like, okay, well, you at least have to accomplish a certain kind of task in order to access a certain area. But as long as you, like, accessing the area is the goal, and then there's multiple solutions, as long as there are multiple solutions, I think it's fine, because then it's like, oh, I can decide to platform onto here, or I can grapple onto here, or I can fly a plane over here, or whatever. Like, there's this one area where it's a kind of a weird example of this, but in order to gain access to a hangar bay where you can buy planes from, you have to essentially have to, like, fly in with a wingsuit is, like, the intended method of doing it. So you have to first unlock the wingsuit through perk points, which are similar to, like, the respect thing, where you get them for certain objectives and for certain challenges. And so you if you don't have that, you can just use a helicopter to land on there. But it's pretty binary in that there's really only two options that you have in order to actually get to the point where you can unlock that area. And that's just like a side area. There's no main story quest associated with it. It's just like one case. But because you can't even, like, I don't know, blow open the hangar door or something, like maybe there would be a trade-off where if you blow open the hangar door, you damage some of the equipment that's inside. And so if you want to get access to the entire thing, that's when you would do the platforming shit. But you can also just choose to take the frontal way in and at least secure the area for yourself. Like, there's not any consideration for a trade-off, basically. It's just, like, you have to do it in this binary manner. Like, maybe there's two options, but for the most part, it's just one. I don't understand why they've decided to railroad it so heavily. And the other thing, too, is, like, it's actually a problem as these games get more, like, photorealistic, for lack of a better term, because it's not really like they look good, but they at least are a bit more representative of reality when you look at their visuals at a glance, before you, like, take in all of the low-resolution textures and shitty post-processing. And as these games are getting to the point where they are a little bit more natural for us to consider, we also have to realize that it's going to become even more confusing, disappointing, stupid, that we can't, like, interact with all of the doors that we see, for example. Like, back in the Saints Row 2 days, it was not an expectation that you'd be able to open up the doors and go inside the houses of all those people that you were driving around. So, like, okay, yeah, sure, you can't go into those doors. Like, that's almost natural because, it's not an expectation. But we've gotten to the point now where they leverage the ability to open doors into some areas, and then other doors are remained locked, and there's usually not enough of a visual distinction to, like, explain why in a satisfactory manner. And even if there was, it's like, oh wow, they just so happen to have boarded up this door with insanely powerful bracings. And they happen to do this for all the other times because, like, I can throw rockets at it. I can just shoot at it with a Gatling gun. I could, like, there's so many things that I could potentially do to blow open this door in a realistic sense, but it's not allowed because the developers didn't actually make that area there. So, I mean, it's very ambitious to try to make an open world game. It's very challenging on a technical level to make it happen. And I'm not saying that it shouldn't be attempted. And I just wanted to sort of couch our analysis basically in the understanding that it's going to be very difficult to do. But if you're not willing to actually allow players to engage with the world in any capacity using all of the tools that you have given them that they could potentially obtain throughout playing, then it feels like you haven't actually bought into the main idea of making an open world game. So, like, why are you marketing it that way? Why are you trying to make it that way if you're also trying to not allow player expression? And that's where it really comes down to for me.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, back then it was obviously not really feasible from a technical standpoint to be able to do games where you can explore every single building in the world that's being presented. But nowadays it's probably possible to do it if they polish the engine enough, which they don't usually do anyway, considering how poorly most games perform, regardless of when they were actually released. But yeah, like I don't know. I mean, I feel like this is another issue where there's a conflict between the the desire to portray the game as an open world, and then the fact that usually it's structured like a linear game most of the time. And I think this is an issue that also regards side quests. In that a lot of the time, I feel like side quests are basically just a waste of fucking time. Like they're basically diluted missions. I don't even know how to say it. Imagine you're having a drink at the bar, like you're having a glass of whiskey, and then someone pours water into the whiskey so that, and in the end, you're left with 1% whiskey and 99% water. At what point are you fucking drinking whiskey anymore? Then, like, it's not really it's not really valuable anymore because it's been diluted and simplified so much where even if they have some good concepts or ideas, they're not really presented in an environment or fleshed out enough where they're really worthwhile. I think they're just basically a way to artificially extend the game's length. This is something that has a long history in Japanese RPG games, for example, but it's pretty much become the standard at this point. Like it's just a disaster. I don't even know how else to call it. At the very least, the early GTA and Saints Row games had more like arcade mini games, where you just had to like find an icon on the map and it would just say, "Oh, kill 50 people in under 2 minutes" or whatever. Basically, just arcade mini games that are pretty much self-explanatory. I mean, they are shallow, sure, but at least they're not really. I mean, they're not really feeling like diluted missions at that point. They're just basically simple mini games that you do. Instead, most of the time, side quests involve much of the same stuff as regular missions, but in an even more simplified and idiotic fashion, in my experience. I don't know if you agree with this or if you've seen any examples that are pertinent in Far Cry.
Well, with Far Cry 5, the way that the side mission stuff works is basically like there's a series of things that will progress your overall progress bar in that zone, and side missions are one of them, but also main, like quote unquote main missions are all lumped together with side missions. So it's actually like like your worst nightmare basically, because they even consider the main the more central missions as being side missions. Like that's how they conceptualize them in the game. They just call them like missions, I'm pretty sure. I mean, there's a separation between like more important missions and then side missions, but they're all lumped together in terms of how they're calculated when it tells you how many you've done versus how many you have left in a certain area. And the side missions are usually just as fucking fetch questy and like in any other world they would be an arcade map, except the phrasing, the conceit, the way that they are presented is almost as if the game wants you to it's trying to imply that this is actually real content you're experiencing. Whereas in reality, it's like there was this one mission. There's a couple of times where it's clear that they try to do something that would be more zany, but I'm not really sure how. It feels like maybe it's a bit too destructive to the thematic of the game or whatever. But there's like this one area where you can like go and get alien technology is what it's called. It's probably going to turn out to be something completely different. I haven't actually finished the quest line, but it's basically like you can go to a farm and find these like glowing turquoise egg-like things that are making a lot of noise, and they're supposed to be like alien technology. At least that's what the quest line says. So that's a case where it's like, otherwise the game is pretty grounded. It's kind of a wacky premise where like a religious cult has taken over an entire area. But you know, whatever. It's there's also well, this is a kind of a side tangent, but there's also a lot of like really cringe lines. Like I killed one of the cult leaders and he was like, "Don't you understand how bad things really are? I mean, look around you. Look who's in charge." And it's set in America, so they're basically saying, by the way, Trump is bad, which is like why am I getting this while playing a video game? Like, surely I can escape. I can finally escape all of the insane fucking, hypercharged, politicized discussions. So it's like, I don't know, man. That's just like, that was a little bit too on the nose for me. Like, surely you can.
I mean, maybe it was just a coincidence, but either way, I think it's just an example of them not giving a fuck.
Well, no, the game came out in 2019, so it was. I mean, there was a ton of controversy around the game because even though the cultists are like just like they're basically portrayed as, charismatic leaders taking advantage of really stupid people. Even though that is the case, they're not portrayed in any like positive light. There's never a case where you think maybe the cult has a point. Like there's never any credence given to their theories whatsoever. But the mainstream media did pan the game for being too light on Republicans or something. Something like that, where it's like you're not allowed to display the far right in this way or something. Like you got to be more harsh on them. You got to condemn them or something. Like I don't know. I don't remember the exact news stories. I'll throw a link in the description if I find any later. But it's that was like a case where like I don't understand. Like at that point, maybe that was just a manufactured headline to make people actually know about the game.
There's also a lot of clickbait around this sort of stuff, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So it's often difficult to tell the difference between what's actually intended by the developers and what's just basically just publicity made up by people. Actually, though this is unrelated, but I was actually looking for this clip where basically you were talking about doors that are locked.
Yeah.
And I just managed to find a 10-second timestamp about someone complaining about the game from the fucking 80s that has the same problem. So.
Oh shit! Let's take a look. Yeah, so I'm looking at this right now, and this is definitely an 80s game.
Yeah, and I mean, the guy says it looks like I can go in here. It looks like a door, but I can't. It's just a decoration. And I mean, it's the same issue that games have today, right? Maybe back then games would not afford to be able to do it, but games have evolved technologically in some ways, but not design-wise in many other ways. I just remember this clip from ages ago. I don't even know how I managed to remember it, but it's just funny since it's basically the same issue we're describing with Far Cry, only in a much older game, like a NES game from the 80s.
Yeah. So that's an example where it's like obviously the issue in that particular clip that's shown is readability of the environment, but that is something that is happening more often. I mean, for one, it's impossible to read modern games anyway with all the post-processing that they slap on shit. And until that stuff gets better, you're actually like I keep talking about virtual reality and how that's going to be epic, but it's actually way more nauseating to look at a game with a bunch of post-processing and virtual reality. So they're going to have to figure out how to actually make their game look reasonable without that. I mean, not that it looks reasonable anyway, but the idea that they're like basically masking it with that is that's got to go. So I'm actually very excited that in theory that could potentially happen, where we could get 3D games that actually try to look good instead of trying to not look bad. If that's how I would break it down. I don't know if you understand that angle, but it's like
I get it.
Yeah, it just feels like a lot of the time they don't even bother. So when it comes to the side quest angle, which is what we were talking about previously, I would say if we look at side quests themselves, the idea behind them, I can't even really I can't even fuck with the idea. Like I can't even really appreciate what they're going for in that respect. Like for my money, like what I would look at it as, it basically seems like not only is it just straight up padding, like you were saying, but often it's inconsequential, or it's some sort of like veiled grind or fetch quest to get you up to the point where you'll have enough points for your RPG system or ammo or money or like some sort of in-game measurement of progress. Like maybe it's something to do with that. The other thing that often happens with side quests is like they are only there because the world doesn't feel right. And it's the same reason why dialogue is in a lot of video games now, where a lot of games have really padded scripts. And the only objective that they are actually working towards is making it so that the player doesn't realize how hollow the content actually is, or how hollow the gameplay loop of the game actually is, because they're too busy getting distracted by the presence of all of the dialogue. It sounds like a crazy fucking conspiracy theory angle to take on that, but that's the only sort of reason that I can come up with. Now, some people would say it's because like the games have this weird habit of trying to be more cinematic now. But I think even that is like a response. It's like an overcorrection because they leaned too far towards the filmic cinematic shit and making their games more movie-like, that they sucked out a lot of what was fun about the older arcade-style games that didn't have any of those conceits, that didn't even have to worry about them because they just provided you with a gameplay experience and you knew it was a game.
Yeah.
Those kinds of games that started to lean more towards the telling a story shit, like the old Metal Gear Solid games and stuff. For one reason or another, they ended up being somewhat financially successful. I don't actually know all of the figures, but I assume that Metal Gear Solid as a franchise has been solvent.
I mean,
so like that's a case where
it's a complete disaster, but it's a disaster that people love with a passion.
Yeah. So like that's an example. I mean, Deus Ex 1 is an example. Half-Life 1 and 2 are examples of this, where it's like games that are trying to be a lot more cinematic. Like again, there's the middle point, which is like Deus Ex and Half-Life, where you still know it's definitely a game, like the old Metal Gear Solid games and stuff. You still know it's definitely a video game. Like you know it's not a movie, but they have so many. Yeah, they have so many elements of what makes a game or what makes software more like a movie, and as a result of that, I think it sort of corrupts the foundation of what makes a game fun to play in the first place. Because if you can only play in pre-selected sequences of time that the developer has allowed you to play in, then you're not really playing a game anymore. Like that's not really the same thing. So those are all examples, I think, of that sort of thing. And I think side quests are just an extension of that root problem. But the problem with side quests specifically is that like there's other elements of a game, like just in general in life, but also when it comes to specifically video games, it's hard to find areas where you can look at just a component of a game or a piece of a puzzle and say, never use that. That can never end well. Like button mashing and QuickTime events are examples of where you can never have that end well. There's no like moderation. There's no like, oh, make it so that happens only sometimes. Like, no, that is literally like anathema. Yeah. Just get it out. But when it comes to like side quests, I actually think that I'm not fully sure of this because I don't actually know how. Basically, what I'm saying is I don't know how you would make it so that side quests are integrated in a positive way to a game. And I don't think we've seen any examples of this. I certainly haven't played any games that have side quests or side missions where it feels like, oh yeah, this is actually important, because by definition they are less important than the main story, and usually the main story doesn't even do itself justice. So that's another component of this, is side quests often take development time away from the main quest line, and the main quest line is usually shit anyway. So if we already have this issue where we're dealing with a shitty story to begin with, and the main story, like we need the main story to have more development time in order for it to be more worthwhile, like the Mass Effect series, for example. Like that's why I encourage especially people who haven't made games before, or haven't made like written stories, or try to come up with campaigns, or whatever the case may be. I never tell them to start with a non-linear story. I always say linear is best. It allows you to just see if you can, work well in a very specific and in theory easy, like bare bones manner, right? Like here's your straightforward storyline. And you don't really get an opportunity to engage with that sort of idea if you're busy, essentially like trying to add in all these side quests and all of these possibilities and all this other stuff. So it's definitely something that would take a lot of development time to get right. But I also question if that is a responsible decision for your time and money, a responsible allocation of your resources when your main content is often really bad too. So I'm not sure if you have any thoughts on follow-up thoughts on side quests or any of the other stuff that I brought up, but that would be my
I agree. It's more that, like I said, I think maybe the best examples I've seen are like mini games or bonus stages, basically from old arcade games and such. Whereas they're basically kind of throwaway in a sense, but they're not really such that they take too much development time away from the main title, and they also feel a little bit more in line with the overall gameplay that the title already has. So they basically felt like less of a walking simulator approach.
Yeah.
Which I think is the issue with many of the side quests. I think it's mostly just an attempt for them to lengthen the story, like the game time, basically. Just, like many people criticize many games for being too short, so they just add a bunch of really poorly devised side quests in order to artificially lengthen the game.
Yeah.
So I think that in itself is a negative approach, basically. Like, if that were removed and they focus on quality and basically just making content last longer because it's actually, like bigger maps or better maps or whatever, instead of just tiny maps with minimal interaction and cutscenes. I mean, cutscenes are always going to be short by definition, right? Unless you're making flame knives. Like, that's probably the only example I can think of with the cutscenes that last as fucking long as the grinding gameplay. Because it's just 3 hours of anime dialogue. But
Yeah.
most games are not like that. Even the games that are heavy on cutscenes and stuff. I mean, not even Deus Ex was like that, for example. So since you're not gonna get much mileage out of having heavy emphasis on cutscenes, I think people should just focus on making better maps and better gameplay. I think that's really, and if they can make it so that side quests also fit into that, then all the better. That's really what I think about it.
Yeah, I really want to stress the development time or resource allocation angle too. When it's a project that's a labor of love and you don't have a time constraint, you don't have a deadline, it's a little bit easier to justify throwing in an Easter egg, because even if it takes a certain amount of time to implement something like that, like say it takes you like 2 extra days or something, like that's nothing for you. That's in the grand scheme of things, that's not really that much compared to what will come eventually. Whereas I think it's very clear in a world where you're dealing with a game development studio that has a publisher and investors and deadlines and margins and all this other shit that corrupts the creative expression of a developer, then you are going to have to be very, very strict, I think anyway, with how you decide to allocate your resources. If your real intention is to make the best game that you can possibly make under those very, very restrictive conditions, then like there's nothing, I really don't think that there's any boardroom meeting that says we need to have fucking Easter eggs or we need to have all this shit. If the boardroom meeting says you need to have side quests, then I would just dip set out of the company. But if that's not feasible for you, and like assuming that that's not the case, then really at that point as a developer, you really ought to find a different way, different angle to engage people. And like you'll never get through to investors, because in their world, it doesn't really matter if your game is high quality. It just matters if your game sells copies. And that really leads to a very bad method. Like, okay, actually, here's an angle that we can kind of sort of steer away from Far Cry 5 about and similar games and go into a little bit more of a general discussion before we circle back to talk about some other stuff. Because something that I actually ended up experiencing a little while ago is Designer Dave released a new video, I think a couple weeks ago, maybe a month ago. And Designer Dave's new video goes over mobile game development and I think it was like microtransactions specifically. It's like basically figuring out ways to like strategies. And I'll see if I can find, I'll definitely have the link in the description, but I'll see if I can find the video real quick.
Sounds like a nightmare.
Well, the main issue with it is that if we look at it, looking at the latest videos, oh yeah, so it's actually documentation. So on its face, it doesn't have anything to do with the content of like microtransactions. But because he's documenting like monetization schemes, it does have that to do with it. Like his examples are related to that. So I've linked that in our chat here, and I'll throw that in the description. The main thing that I took away from this is I don't even know if I could finish the whole video, because there was this one part where he says that you want to give people an option to spend hundreds of or thousands of dollars in case they decide to do that. Like, and the way that he explained it, I can't even really do it justice. The way that he explained it was basically like, well, if they're going to do that anyway, this is for whales, and if they're going to be whales, then they might as well be your whales or something like that. It's like actually made
basically
my
like
stomach.
People justifying drug sales pretty much at this point.
Like
people are gonna take drugs, you may as well sell it to them.
If they're gonna be asking for drugs, we may as well be the ones who provide it. Yeah, it's like fucking sickening. So like stuff like that happened, and like I think that sheds a light on this guy has, to his credit, he has been a game designer for a while. Well, at least a designer. We could say that much. And he's designed systems like monetization systems, like we've just talked about. So, like, in such a situation, he's got some expertise in the area. And to hear that from the fucking horse's mouth, you know what I mean? Like, that's crazy. That actually really does shock me in a way.
Yeah, saying the quiet part out loud, pretty much.
Yep. So that's just something that was incredible that happened recently, that I happened upon recently, I should say. And I think it segues nicely out of my last point, where I was talking about how there's all of this infrastructure that essentially corrupts the purity of the thought process behind it being creative, or just the creative process itself. It's like, as a creative person, you want to make the best creative product you can make. Like, you're trying to improve your craft, you're trying to make stuff that's important to you specifically, and none of that has to happen. Like, you don't have to be improving your products, or processes don't have to improve. There doesn't need to be any improvement in the games industry space for you to be successful. And if you conflate improving as a marketer or something like that, I guess in that case, on a technical level, like, I should have said nothing about you creatively has to improve, but like your design process for video games, your the way that you handle people in general, like you're working alongside other members of your team, like, none of that shit has to improve for your game to be successful. All that has to happen is that it taps into the right, like, neurological systems and all that stuff. So, like, if you can manage to, skate by with that idea, then you can still find success in the industry. And I think that it can actually crush people's souls. Like, I actually feel like that probably broke designer Dave. Like, maybe he at some point wanted to be an actual game developer, and now he's stuck, like, just doing this shit for money because he has to, or he believes he has to. But I'm purely speculating there. But I feel like the industry is the worst place to be if you actually want to be designing games.
Yeah, it's a bit like maybe in a corrupt environment, like a corrupt business environment or anything like that. Like, maybe some people don't start off to be corrupt, like politicians maybe, but they become corrupt over time because they adjust to the environment they're in, pretty much. Yeah. So I think that's pretty much the case in the gaming industry, which is one of the most backwards in many ways of all the industries, I have to say. I mean, considering the products that are released, I think it's pretty clear to see that. But actually, I have another clip I wanted to show you, since this is from when you were talking about the fact that graphics in VR need to look better. I just want to show you this map. I don't know if you've ever played this game, actually. Max Payne 3. Have you ever played it?
I think I played the very first one, so no, not that one.
Oh, I mean, take a look at this, like, quick time event boss fight of like 15 seconds, and look at the scene where he pulls the gun out of the body. It's pretty great.
Well, I can't believe how many quick time events are over here. Wow, and all of I like that they panned up very quickly just to try to hide that, I guess. I don't know what happened there.
Yeah.
That's
fucking fantastic. Like, I mean,
all cutscenes, game movie, by the way.
Yeah. I recently rewatched this because I played this game a long time ago, and for whatever reason I felt like rewatching the story of it, because I just wanted to see what a disaster it was, and man, it was really a disaster. Like, I think this game is a pretty clear example of everything that's wrong with game writing and storytelling. Like, if you ever get around to play it, it's probably like a 10-hour playthrough at most. It's maybe even less. You're gonna experience some real insane dialogue and stuff, and people praise this kind of storytelling. Whereas there's plot holes everywhere. There's characters that don't make any sense, that exist only to serve you need a villain, so I have this guy who was a villain for like 10 seconds before he gets blown to pieces. Stuff like that. It's just a fucking disaster all the way through. And again, this game is set in Brazil, in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And it actually reminds me of, I don't know if you've ever heard of the film City of God. It's a movie from, I think, 2002, I believe.
I have not heard of it.
It's a pretty popular film. It's I'll just link this. It's set in the Brazilian favelas, which is the same setting as this game. And the problem is that the storytelling and the cinematography and everything else, even though it's a movie, obviously, is way better. And same for this other film, which is also pretty popular. It's also set in the slums of Brazil, Rio de Janeiro. And it's pretty similar thematically. Like in Max Payne 3, you also have the special operations police, just like in this movie. But the difference is night and day. This is what I'm talking about when I say that games try to be movies, but they don't have what it takes to be movies. Essentially, they just don't have what it takes. And considering how very similar thematically Max Payne 3 is to these two movies, which are City of God and Elite Squad, that many people probably have watched since they're pretty popular. it just goes to show that they try to be movies, but they cannot compete with real movies. But because players have no standards, and maybe they don't even watch movies, they only watch anime or whatever. I actually know a lot of people who refuse to watch movie because they only watch anime and play games for whatever reason. So that's how they can be successful, because they thrive in an environment where the standards are extremely low, essentially. I mean, we've talked about this plenty of times. But as soon as they've put side to side with a product that's similar thematically, like this case, for example, then it's just night and day, pretty much.
Yeah.
There's no escape.
Absolutely. No, one of the things that I think I can jump off of here is looking at Dead Space 1. One of the things that happened in one of the reviews that was like quoted, I think on the Wikipedia page or something, is that they said that game had a film-worthy script. And I think that even coming from a critic or a reviewer as opposed to an actual developer, it's not really the same thing as if the developer came out and said, we wanted to make something as good as a movie or whatever. But I think that there's this aura around filmmaking in the games industry. And Mesk alleged that people just ended up not actually like making it in the film industry, and they essentially went to games as a second choice. I don't know what his sources are on that or how real that is. Maybe that's just his like observational stuff. Like he's sort of reverse engineering that or something. That I could believe that, you know, that it sounds correct on a premise. I'll say that much. But when we're considering all of these games where they so very much emulate like pop culture, as particularly movies that are related to the themes, some people would say that that's because they're culturally or creatively bankrupt, right? They don't actually have what it takes to be creative and innovate and create their own sort of like inspiration in that sense. And maybe that's true. But I also think that you're always going to have some sort of inspiration for something you're doing, because nobody actually creates in a vacuum. So there's always going to be some element where that you can trace something back to an older experience, you know, some movie or game that came before. And obviously, like, some stuff is a bit more popular than others. Like the Lovecraft continues to be a very heavy inspiration for games and movies. And some people will even like market their game as Lovecraftian or something, because like people are just really that interested in that source material. So there's examples of stuff like that. When it comes to Dead Space 1, the script wasn't even close to being film worthy. Like the script was actually, it was straight up something out of a fucking like fan fiction, like first draft, where the main character, the protagonist, doesn't actually speak at all. He does have a voice in the second game. They actually gave him a voice, but he doesn't speak at all in the first one. He's a silent protagonist. And he basically comes in and he says, well, he doesn't say anything. He is watching this video that was sent to him by his wife, and he watches the video like several times during the game. And he's actually watching the video at the opening of the game. Like, that's how important the video is, not only to him, but also to the narrative, that they open us up with looking at that. And you'd think maybe it's effective because it's like establishing that he has got a personal stake in the story, and that's why he does it. It's a neat, reasonable way to establish his motivation, that he's there, he's trying to help his wife or save his wife or whatever. The problem is that he never watches the whole video. And that's supposed to be an epic plot twist where, like, every single time he has the opportunity to, he decides to close it out, or it actually just closes on its own. It's not like you can control it. But if there's a scene at the end where one of the characters that was supposed to be your ally initially, but turns out to be your enemy, is like, you didn't even watch that whole video. Take a closer look. And then he watches the whole video, and at the end his wife just shoots herself in the head or something. So it's like, oh wow, the whole twist was she was dead this whole time, and blah blah. Like, it's so ineffectual, and it ends up feeling so fucking like pedestrian. It's like such a cringe, like 6-year-old writing twist.
Yeah, it feels like an afterthought. Like they didn't put a single bit of care into it.
Yeah.
I mean, you could argue that maybe, like, I don't know, the protagonist is mentally ill and delusional, and he actually doesn't want to believe that his wife is dead, so he like builds up a false narrative where he only watches part of the first part of the clip in order to convince himself that his wife isn't dead. But again, that's just a completely alien interpretation. That's just me covering up the game designer's ass in a sense. Like, they're not really making it clear. They're just being lazy. Like, I'm just excusing their laziness, which as a player I should not have to do.
Oh yeah, and that's something that happens all the time. Is like you basically have to read into a story to try to find some solution to obvious plot holes. Now, in that particular case, why he didn't read the whole or watch the whole thing, I don't know. It doesn't even matter if it's technically justifiable because it plays out so poorly. It plays out like it, it's just, oh, suddenly there's a twist, epic. Except I'm not invested whatsoever, so like I don't understand how I'm supposed to appreciate that. And then if we look at like, I mean, really, what game has ever had a villain where you've thought this guy's respectable? Like this guy's not a fucking laughingstock, and he's not cringing me with his bad dialogue or his monologues or whatever. Like there haven't really been that many that have both been well written and voice acted, but also like actually had impact on the story. Like there's some people who have some interest. It's like some high quality voice acting is in the original StarCraft game. Like Mengsk is pretty well voice acted, but his script is fucking laughable. His decisions don't make any sense. Like the way that he's written doesn't work out. Even though he's got a competent voice actor, and even though he does have impact in the narrative, the way that he has impact is horrible. So like that's you're out that example. Like obviously there's tons of villains throughout the history of video games, but it's just I can't imagine actually going in and trying to do something in like trying to come up with an idea for a well-written video game villain or any sort of well-written video game character even. Like all of the examples I think could be debated at best if they can't just be initially dispensed with immediately. You know what I mean? Like if that's the case that we're at, where pretty much all popular video game characters don't fit within a video game or aren't well-written or aren't even like well voice acted or whatever, like at that point, where are you? And that's the thing is like the probably the best in terms of objective analysis in a vacuum, just looking at their character, the best video game characters probably come from games that aren't even games, that just like force you to be a cameraman, or like Metal Gear Solid games or something. I'm sure somebody would be like, my favorite character is Big Boss or something, like whatever the case may be there. The problem with Metal Gear Solid as a franchise.
Somehow I'm very skeptical about Metal Gear Solid having good characters, but my experience with the series is very limited, so I don't know.
Well, I haven't even played a single one of the games, so I can't say. But the fact is that it's
anime, though, like that literally anime.
Yeah, it's a very popular franchise, and it has so many filmic elements to it that stop it from actually being a video game. So I'm sure people would say that the characters in there are strong. But then you're basically saying all you have to do to find an example of a good video game character is look outside of the video game medium to the interactive borderline software stuff. You know what I mean? Like that's crazy. Like imagining that has to be the case. So obviously, like I'm sure there's going to be some counter argument. I'm sure somebody's going to say that they think that the X character is well written or whatever. But I just like there's the fact that we can't find anything. We've both played a lot of games. We've both played a lot of games that have characters in them, and the fact that there's not even like a strong front runner even feels really bad. You know what I mean? Like there should be just something immediately accessible or something that comes to mind, because if you had to name off like movie characters that were compelling, it's pretty trivial to do. And like I think I've played way more video games than I've watched movies, if I had to count the number. So like the fact that
it's the same here, and I can think of more movie examples for sure.
Yeah,
like it's not even. And again, like since I've brought up Max Payne 3, I might as well talk about the plot of that game and how it's a disaster. So since they're actually that's actually the main problem of Max Payne 3 as well, that the villains don't make any sense. Like literally, they don't make sense. So the plot of the game in a short summary is that you basically are a New York retired cop, and for whatever reason, a guy from Brazil who claims to have worked with you from the academy, and the main character is drunk at that point, so he doesn't even know if it's true or not. He basically tells you to come to work as private security in Brazil, to work for the powerful family of the Brancos, which is like an elite family, obviously fictional in Brazil. And like you work for Rodrigo Branco, who's a wealthy businessman, like he's very rich. And then you work for his brother as well, was Victor Branco, who is a politician, but he's not as wealthy as his brother. But they work together, basically. The businessman brother finances his political brother's campaigns, etc. So the entire plot of the game is that there's this conspiracy going on about trafficking human organs from the poor people of Brazil. And this is done through Victor Branco, the politician Branco, and they murder Rodrigo Branco, the businessman brother, because he's honest and he doesn't want anything to do with it. But he doesn't even know about the conspiracy, and he's literally their main source of income because he finances them.
Yeah.
And they do what they do thanks to his money, and he doesn't know. And yet they want him dead, but it's never explained why. Like, it doesn't make any sense why they would do that. And the way this is basically a plot twist. Again, I'm spoiling the game, but I don't really think it's that big of a deal because it's pretty simple overall in terms of story. And this is a twist where at one point you go to kill the head of the police in Brazil, in Sao Paulo, who's literally involved in the human trafficking stuff. And the Victor Branco brother, the politician, comes at you with a gun and says, "Oh, I'm actually the bad guy after all." And he's actually working with the police to traffic human organs. And it's like they just had to have this guy be a villain for the sake of having a villain. His motivations don't make sense. He kills his own brother, who's his main source of income, for no reason that is ever stated in the game. And there's not even any reason why any of the characters do what they do. Like, sure, they're trafficking organs, but that's none of what they do makes sense in the game. Like, the villains just don't. They don't have proper motivation to do what they're doing. None of them. The police, the politicians, the gangs, like, none of them have any idea. Like, none of it is coherent in any way. Like, again, if you haven't played the game, obviously you're not going to have a full picture. But if you do end up playing or even seeing it or whatever, it's just like there's just nothing about it that's meaningful, deep, or impactful. It's just throwaway characters just to have them in the story.
Right. Well, I think something like that happens in very many games. Like, there's very few games that have a decently sized cast of characters. Like, I struggle to name straightforward narratives. I guess the most straightforward kinds would be like maybe the Halo franchise has kind of straightforward narratives where you're just like fighting aliens, or like obviously like the games that have even less story than that, like Doom and stuff, where there's not really much of a story there. It's just like it's basically just justification for where you are and what you're doing. So like stuff like that is like the closest we have to straightforward narratives. I think we talked about this on the Big Boys Table podcast a while back, but the idea of cutscenes in general, I feel like are horribly misused in video games. And that's its own conversation where like, if there's ever any story information that is 100% like, basically if any events occur in cutscenes, I think that's the wrong thing. Like, cutscenes should probably be limited to just briefing you on a mission, maybe giving you an overview of what you're going up against, or a debriefing after a mission. But if you are killing a character in a cutscene, or if you're making some sort of, like, if you're showcasing an event that radically changes things, that's the really, really bad use of a cutscene, because video games are about interaction. And if there's an event in the story that's important, or that's really of any level of importance, it doesn't have to be like the most important event. Literally any event that could potentially change things or reconstruct or recontextualize certain elements of the narrative, that shit needs to be experienced in gameplay for it to really have the full impact as a player, for you to really engage with it. And the idea that like if you just skip cutscenes you have no idea what's happening in a story, I think like that's a really obvious case where like if you, that's how you know that they're basically being leveraged incorrectly in a video game space. And you also made this point about like Dead Space 1 where maybe you can excuse the goofiness of him not watching the whole transmission. I even came up with an idea where the character that is your ally that it ends up being your enemy, if she was the one who constantly interrupted you in the middle of you watching a video, because that sort of happens in the first time you're watching it, but then all of the other times you're watching it, she's nowhere to be found, so it doesn't really happen there. But if she's the one who constantly interrupts it, it's like, oh, at least like she's trying to make sure that you like she's like helping you be remain deluded or something. But even then, it still is like super happenstance. You basically have to imagine that there's never a point in time where I might watch the whole video, because that's the only way that her plan could work. And so like that's where her villain plan is like stupid. Whereas if you're dealing with a situation like the rest of it, the point that you made is that maybe you have an unreliable narrator, an unreliable protagonist in terms of the headspace that they're in. And my main issue with that is sort of like my main issue with in Prey, in the 2017 Prey game, there's the simulation argument where you basically are in a simulation in that game, and that's okay in some sense, but like I actually don't think that there's a problem with that. I also don't necessarily think there's a huge problem with the unreliable narrator thing. But the problem comes from trying to analyze the content, where you're basically making it so that you could, in theory, if you were dishonest, you could hand wave away any bug, any plot hole, any sort of issue with character consistency. You could just say, well, it's because you've got a mental illness, or it's because you're in a simulation.
Yeah.
You know, it ends up being a catch-all, sort of a cop-out to justify problems within video games. And this is less of a problem of real developers, like fully actual members of the writer's staff or whatever, coming out and saying this sort of stuff. This has happened with Blizzard a few times, but it doesn't usually happen in general. Most of the time it happens with fans who use it as a way to sort of cover the asses of the developers in a similar way to what you were describing. And it makes it really frustrating because you can't even really engage with these people in terms of thinking of what they like. You can't actually get to a point where you can have interesting discussions because you're too busy dealing with this shit. Like these people, these boring like entry level things. It's sort of going back to what we talked about in the second episode of the Street Dog podcast. And it was something that I said about halfway through, I think, where I mentioned that we were mostly criticizing the development process of the individual and not the content of the individual. Mm-hmm. And I had to make that clear because I knew people otherwise would just go into the comment section or come away potentially without commenting with the idea that we weren't doing that, that we were actually supposedly criticizing their work and without having played their work. And like, I knew people would take that straw man approach, even though that's not what we were doing at all, because it's like that's the base level, like stupid argument that you can make to sort of, almost have a gotcha. It's almost like when you're dealing with people on like news broadcasts and they're having some sort of debate or a YouTube debate even, where it's like, if you can get the zinger in that makes the audience turn to your side, even if your argument is not substantive, people will still, like the public opinion will still vote in your favor in that sense. And that's sort of like what I imagine is like people will find some sort of stupid base level gotcha to try to corrupt your entire argumentation or the people's expectations of your argument instead of actually engaging with your argument. And that's sort of same thing as like anytime you're including this in a game, anytime you're including mental illness or some sort of like unreliable element, be it through the environment with simulations or through the characters with mental illness or whatever, anytime that you have that, like you're basically giving carte blanche to these people. And again, that shouldn't stop you from using it. Like I still think you can do interesting things with these premises, but
absolutely, yeah.
If people as like who are discussing video games, not even necessarily critiquing them, but analyzing them, thinking about them, talking about them, if those people, if we as a whole group of individuals can't start having more intelligent and deep conversations about stuff, we're never going to get to the interesting stuff. We're never going to really talk about like the merits of a certain decision. And it also doesn't help that like most games have such stupid plots and characters such that in order for like a villain's evil plan to work, it's like think of all the shit that you criticize bad movies for. It's like when a comic book movie comes out and the villain's plan has to like it must rely on every single possible thing going right for them. Like so much stuff is left to chance, and because it's a movie, it happened. But otherwise, it wouldn't have happened. You know what I mean? Like that's lazy writing in the same way that we experience in the video games space. So I don't see any distinction at all there. I think it's very, very similar. And that's an issue that plagues movies as well. So that's a case where video games don't really help in that respect. Like they don't buck the trend. And that's a case where you really wanted them to too. Like that's not something that we should really have to deal with, in my opinion. So it's really boring. Like it doesn't help that sort of like what I was talking about there. You don't have an opportunity to go deep into video games anyway, because video games are very shallow. But you're stopped even at the door before you can observe and talk about how shallow they really are by people sort of taking these like really stupid low level arguments of, straw men, basically like, oh, it's a simulation, or, oh, it's a mental ill protagonist, or, oh, you can't criticize my favorite game because that means you're criticizing me as a person. It's like all these things that don't fly at all, that aren't actually true whatsoever, but it's just like surface level argumentation that really pisses me off in the video game space. I'm assuming it happens in other spaces as well. I know it happens in some other spaces that I've had interactions with it, but it just feels like with video games, it's another level. And maybe that's my bias because I've been talking about video games for a long time. But it just feels like it's a deeper level there. Maybe because, like you were saying, with people who just watch anime all the time and play video games all the time, it's like if it's all they've ever known, they might not ever get to a point where they can like imagine talking about something at a deeper level.
Well, I actually have a discussion I want to make regarding what you've said, and I'm going to start by bringing up what Belafol said a year ago. I can't believe I actually remember this, but essentially what he said is that developers are trying too hard to be fancy with their story. And he says, it's just like these stupid graphic wars and shit. Developers are just trying to one-up each other. And I think that's a perfect way to describe it. Think about all these game stories we've been discussing, like Dead Space and Max Payne 3, for example. What is really the driving force behind the story? Because we discussed how all the characters are shallow, all their actions don't really make sense. So what actually is there? What is there is stupid plot twists left and right. Like this guy has to be a villain, like he's actually the guy you were working for, but he turns out to be the bad guy. Or that video clip shows the woman is dead, but you don't find out until later. Like it just has to be this stupid plot twist that they really try to force down your throat, because they're really the only thing that drives the storyline forward ultimately. Like they're really the sticking points essentially. Let's think about a great movie, Casino, for example, from '95, which is considered to be one of the best movies ever made. I mean, the storyline in that movie is pretty complex, but overall, many of the stuff that happens, like the main reason why many of the things happen in the movie is literally because of random chance. Like, as an example, during the movie, at one point, the FBI starts listening in on one guy who's in on a casino frauding scheme. And but the reason they start listening to his phone and shit is because of an unrelated murder that happened years ago. And the movie doesn't even describe what it was. The movie literally says it was an unrelated murder that happened how long ago. Who knows who the fuck it even was? But that's what the FBI was investigating. Obviously, the movie is based on a real story, so it was a real murder that happened at the time. But because they were investigating the murder, they stumbled upon the casino fraud scheme. And I think that's a much more natural way of developing your story, instead of everything having to be a fucking conspiracy or plot twist or unseen change of pace. Again, like we were discussing the change of pace stuff. I guess this is what they were trying to do as well with the change of pace approach, only applying it to the story instead. But I just feel like having it be a roller coaster of alternate motives and people not being what they really were. I mean, I'm not saying every character should be entirely linear and entirely to be taken at face value, but when you have a story, and I brought up Max Payne 3, and another example is another game I've played, which is Yakuza 5, where literally almost every character is turns out to be someone else than they really were. It's just a situation where the only thing you have that's driving the story forward is the fucking plot twists. And I think that's just a really, really poor way of going about it. But because it's also the main way that people do it, like Battlefall said, they're just trying to one-up each other. So Max Payne 3 has 3 or 4 characters that do plot twists, basically, where they end up being the villains. Whereas Yakuza 5 has, 20 of them. I don't even fucking remember how many he had. Like, it's just a situation where they're just trying to race each other to the finish line by coming up with as much bullshit as they possibly could, instead of actually working on the story and the script. I don't know if what I'm saying actually makes sense, or if you can relate to it regarding the games you've played, but I feel like if they try to do away with plot twists a little bit more and focus more on characters that were more genuine, like more believable, more well structured, less shallow, and it was their actual actions one way or another that actually led to the actions taking place, instead of which always being a design that you cannot in any way influence because you're just a victim of circumstances, right? As a player, you don't actually get to make any choices because you were the pawn all along. Ho ho ho. Yeah. I mean, if they did that, I think storylines would improve substantially instead of it relying so much on plot twists as they do. I don't know what you think about this aspect.
I think that if you, like we were saying earlier, I referenced the idea that nobody develops in a vacuum, nobody creates in a vacuum, so there's always going to be some influences that take place there.
Yeah.
And I think a big part of considering the idea that developers are one-upping each other consistently, I would say that one of the things that I actually wanted to talk about as a main point, but it got superseded by all of the movie game stuff because I was fed up with that instead. So we'll have to talk about this in more depth as the next one or at a later date. But one of the things that I thought was kind of interesting is tracking in iteration, not necessarily improvement, but change in mechanics from game to game amongst multiple franchises. And like one of the very obvious ones is Assassin's Creed. We can actually also look to Dead Space 2. I talked about this before we went on air, but Dead Space 2 levels up over Dead Space 1 in some ways, or iterates on some of the systems there. I think they add a couple new guns that I'd never bothered with. They have maybe a couple new enemy types. I think all of the kids are new, and then maybe some other ones. But then all of the, like, for the most part, the only other change that I noticed in terms of the core gameplay loop was that they increased the number or they improved the way that you can navigate 0G areas. So those are really the only changes, is like some new enemies to fight that are very, very stupid in terms of how they are actually balanced. Some new, what do you call it? Some new like guns. So some new weapons to use. And then maybe a couple of permutations on the existing stuff. And then there was also some slight modifications to the mechanics in areas that are very seldom used anyway. So,
if I'm not mistaken, in Dead Space 1, the protagonist is silent, but in Dead Space 2, it's not, right?
Yeah, yeah. So that's another. Yeah, that is a fair point to make as well. That's another thing that was changed, is that they actually gave him a script, which is an improvement as well, I should say. I almost completely forgot about that, even though I said that earlier. So yeah, those are some examples where the game has changed from the first installment to the second installment. But going back to the Assassin's Creed example, obviously it's completely different now than where it started. And if you actually go back and look at all the games that have released, because were on like a yearly cycle with these things, just pumping them out like fucking candy, like Call of Duty or something, they basically had a series of games where the combat was very, very similar. And then over time it started to morph. They added naval combat with the third game, but it was only for some scripted sequences, I think, or very, very limited in terms of its use. And then they improved on that for the fourth game, which is all about piracy and stuff. And then as time went on, they started adding in like RPG and gear systems. And I think that was in like 2 games ago now. And then Odyssey came out, which was the previous installment. Now there's Valhalla. And the Valhalla is like the third game to include this sort of RPG shit and the different kind of combat and stuff. So if we consider all of the, like, how they've iterated over each installment, I think that there's something interesting to take a look at there is essentially like finding ways to, in theory, improve the game, not just changing it because you want to change it for the sake of change, which is what like Blizzard has done with StarCraft 2, for example, for a long time. And where they've just like changed the balance and stuff, what Riot does with League of Legends, what a lot of MOBAs deal with in general. And when we're considering stuff like how single player installments end up morphing, it's like there's always going to be some area where if you have been able to really tap into the creative process, when you go back to experience the first installment of something you worked on, all you're going to be able to see is the flaws, like the missed opportunities or the things that you weren't able to do properly. And when you actually have the ability to take responsibility for that, because it's not like there was a legitimate reason for it, it was just your own incompetence. Like that's where a lot of the best growth can occur, because then you can say, well, now I can leverage my skills from years of development to make an improved version of a project or something. Whereas if you look to like people who are I would hazard a guess that the developers of Armies of Exego, for example, like they actually did seem like they wanted to create a high quality game, but they got fucked by their publisher, or they made some bad decisions with who they got into bed with in that respect, because they went from EA to Ubisoft or something like that. So both of them just destroyed them. And that's a situation where while they made the decision to go there, at the same time, it's like these people were victims of circumstance, almost like you were talking about with characters. It's like they were just along for the ride in many respects, and they couldn't. These developers couldn't really make the same levels of decisions, and that's an area where you're actually limiting your growth because you can't take responsibility for those decisions that were made. So I don't know. I would say that there's the way that this cycles back into the idea of, are game developers aping from each other? Are they just copying each other and stuff and one-upping each other? I think the answer to that is, I mean, for sure there's some game developers that play a lot of other games and may be inspired by some of those games. I'm sure there's also some weird ego shit where they're like, "Oh, you did this. Well, I have to be better than you, so I'm going to do this." Maybe that developer, that like developer A may have copied something from developer B, and then developer B finds out and has to do the same thing that developer A did, but better. And maybe, there's all sorts of different things that could be happening there.
Yeah.
If I had to speculate. But I think it's more destructive if you just consider the thought process of like of any sort of developer comparing their work to somebody else's. I mean, the main issue is we can't even really criticize the developmental process of video games because they are at the whims of publishers nowadays. They're at the whims of investors. They're not really creating a video game. They're creating a product to be sold. And there's a way to do both, but there's also like, no matter like if there's any percentage of it, of the intention is to make money as opposed to make a quality product. If that's if that's to any degree the majority priority, or even a significant portion of your priorities, like that's going to corrupt how you are actually developing content. So I would just take it like that. Like I can't imagine. I can imagine more so people are having a tough time worrying about how they're going to get this development, how they're going to get this product across the finish line before the deadline, and maybe that leads to them copying from people. But also, like, it's a lot easier to do something that everybody else has done. So I'm not sure. I don't know what you think of all that.
I mean, like I said, the example I gave was mostly regarding the storyline. Obviously, influence, like you said, nobody develops in a vacuum. It's the dialogue where we're talking about, I think, 2 podcasts ago. But yeah, like ultimately, like I said, if it's an environment where the only thing they experience is games like this, then they're not really gonna try to break the mold in that sense. They're just gonna. I'm just gonna bring this example, which I think is probably a little bit too far-fetched, but we'll see. One thing that I've really seen a lot often lately is that people look at the symbolism or something of something instead of the actual message behind it. So, for example, just to quote this, like some people were using Punisher avatars on Twitter or whatever because they support the police in America, I think. And someone said that, well, Punisher, like, it's a comic book character. I think it's a Marvel, maybe. I'm not really familiar. But apparently the original story is that Punisher actually hates the police and he actually kills many policemen himself. But these people don't know that. So they just see the image of the guy who's being a tough on crime guy, and they just put that on because they think it actually is a pro-police avatar, even though it isn't, right? So if they were coherent with their message, they would not have that. They would have something else. But because they look at the symbolism instead of the message itself, that's where you end up with. There's many examples of this case, but I think the key point that I'm trying to make is that when it comes to games trying to be like movies, that's really the key issue, where games try to be like movies, but they try to get the symbolism that they get from movies. They don't really look too much otherwise at the cinematography or the writing or the screenwriting or the acting or whatever. They just look at it very superficially. Like anyone can just watch a movie and get a vague idea. Like, let's say you go to, I don't know, fucking Sentinel Island, where they're literally living still in the Stone Age. It's a remote island off the coast of India. If you go to there and you pick up a tribesman from that island and you show them a movie, they've never seen a movie before, they've never seen technology before. You show them a movie, but they're going to be sort of able to understand what a movie is like after seeing it. But they're not going to be able to deeply analyze screenwriting and acting and stuff like that. They're just going to have a very, very superficial, symbolic opinion of what a movie is like. And I feel like this is what game developers a lot of the time do, where they look at movies, but only as a symbol, as an example to follow superficially, not as something that they actually try to analyze and break down and try to import the best things from it that they possibly could. I think that's really, again, I don't know if this example is a bit too far-fetched, if the symbolism comparison holds up, but I think that's really the key problem that a lot of game developers struggle with, ultimately. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, so I would say if we compare the idea of, one of the things that struck me when you said that people are focusing on the symbolism over the message, what I would say is, like, most people are still, it goes back to our conversation about game, like any sort of discussion on video games where they are surface level. And so the idea is they don't actually have much to say because they haven't thought about it that deeply. And because their headspace is in such a shallow area with the way that they're discussing stuff, it results in them having shallow discussions. And the surface level shallow things are often related to what you can immediately identify when you look at stuff. I mean, if you look at film analysis, a lot of this stuff happens as well, where it's like people are trying to, like there was a film, sci-fi film recently called Annihilation, and I thought it had some problems and also some nice visuals, but it was very clearly one of those narratives that's not meant to be broken down in like a super factual way. It sort of goes back to the idea of like what we were talking about with Dead Space 2 or with Prey 2017, where it's like because of the circumstances, there's something unreliable happening. And that throws more objective, straightforward, linear, if you like, analysis, which can be quite deep and can be quite useful in more straightforward narratives. It throws that kind of stuff out the window given those circumstances. And so you have to conceptualize that when you're thinking about a film or even a game that leverages these kinds of things. But again, we can't even get to the point where we can converse about those things in detail if everybody's busy talking about, well, what did that really mean? What really happened? Ending explained. And you get all these like weird YouTube videos where that are just basically people like breaking down their objective interpretation of what happened. They're like, here's what actually happened in the story, or here's what we were presented. And they're missing what was actually going on there. And I mean, I don't really know how to combat that or fix that, because it's possible to, if you know the intent of the developer or of the film writer or whatever, the director, if you know the intent behind the team that made the product, you can objectively assess how effective they were at that. And you can also figure out like basically you can decide if the point of the movie was not to tell a story that it had a defined ending point or whatever, like that's fine, right? Like you don't need to have you don't need every single story to have a for sure like linear progression of events that where the ending is purely 100% defined. It can be sort of up to interpretation at that point, and you can still critique the process that got you to the kinds of interpretations that there are, because then it's like certain interpretations are going to be more valid than others based on the sort of material that you have to go off of. And if you can get the developers on the record to say, like, here's the kinds of interpretations we were expecting, here's some stuff that surprised us that we don't think is correct at all, like that can allow you to understand how effective they were at actually like allowing the right kinds of interpretations, if that makes any sense. So this is kind of like a hazy description of it, but I think that the same sort of thing happens with surface level conversation as to what you're describing, where people are like rallying behind certain symbols or looking to like basically just the presence of a little bit of symbology to people who don't know about like that many products that leverage symbology but actually have substance behind the style. They're going to think that anything with style is objectively better and significantly more improved than a more straightforward thing that doesn't have all of the style, but still has a decent amount of substance of actual content there. And I think that that's an easy way to conceptualize it anyways. Like for it's sort of like, if you don't know how a custom campaign is put together in StarCraft and you see like a bunch of custom units, you might be like, holy shit, that's epic. I can't believe they added custom units. Because your expectations are maybe lower because you don't know the technical side of things. And to the same degree, if there's something like a custom terrain tile that seems much more mundane than an epic new unit, but the custom terrain tile had more man hours put into it, or required you to hack into the engine in order to facilitate the creation of that tile and implement that tile, and required like an entire new tool to be implemented in that sense, like you're not going to know all of that as just some guy who's playing. So essentially the nuance is lost on the people who are just looking at it from the surface level. And I think that's like another allegory to the sort of the idea that you're talking about here. The I'm forgetting what the term is for this, but it's like the
symbolism.
Well, no, it's like just the advent or the event of having somebody tap into symbolism over what is actually being there, like that phenomenon,
substance, I guess.
Yeah, that phenomenon of people being overly praising or reliant on symbolism, on style, without really understanding the substance behind it. I think that happens all over the place, but gaming seems
not just in games for sure.
Yeah, but gaming does seem to be disproportionately affected by it. And again, this might be our bias coming out as people who talk to a lot of people in video game spaces. Like, obviously, recently the Cyberpunk 2077 stuff has been happening. I'm sure we'll talk about that in the next episode as well, since it's going to be out by then, I think, unless they delay it for the millionth time. But that's a situation where, like, a lot of people have bought into the hype for that thing, and I feel like other things don't have the same hype. Like, you don't see insane hype trains happen for, like, movies. You might see some people who are interested in it and want to go watch it, but I just don't understand why, like, not only do games get more hyped, which obviously leads to more people who are disappointed because they have ridiculously inflated expectations and oftentimes aren't even really honest with themselves about, like, the space that video games are in now. But I'm not sure how video game players, like the audience or the demographic, continues to be had by all of these people. And I assume it's a combination of the more nefarious sort of like gambling stuff that goes on in video games, or like marketing shit where they're tapping into your brain and trying to figure out, like, how do we give you the biggest endorphin hit. But there's also the idea of, like, I would imagine anyway that most game players are younger than moviegoers on average. So, like, there's a wider demographic for moviegoers. So you're probably just going to get that.
I would say that movies, well, there are some movies that have definitely been hyped even recently. I think I remember Joker being one of them, where there was a really high expectation for it. And then there was also, like, the fucking Marvel movie with the glove that erases the world. I don't even know what the fuck that was. Maybe watched that.
Infinity War, and
I remember that one was also...
I've watched all three of the movies that you're referencing, actually, so I can speak to those a little bit. But yeah, the reason why Joker was hyped was something a little bit different, though. That was because the media blasted it as being incel love letter or something. But it actually wasn't. Like, the people who were political in that movie who were painted positively were actually leftists. So the idea that it sort of goes back to that thing with Far Cry 5 where the fucking, like, anti-political or like the political messaging
it's
of it.
It's basically media hysteria, basically, the way you've described it. Like, it's not actually stuff that's present necessarily in the movie, but just people trying to fucking get clickbaits over insane shit in their media articles, pretty much.
Yeah, and then there's the people who buy into it and actually believe it, who basically bought into their own bullshit, right? Who people who are writing the clickbait but actually think that the clickbait is real, I guess. Like that's the kind of people who perpetuate that cycle, I think. So yeah, I think that had something to do with it, and then that drove more people to check it out because, like, that's the Streisand effect, right? Where you condemn something for being heinous, and people are like, oh, I got to check it out now because you've added this layer of, like, forbidden knowledge to it or something, and then you check it out, and it's like, it's a half decent movie. Like, it's got all of the workings of a real movie. So, like, you know, especially compared to the things that came out relatively recently, like, that's probably the best movie or one of the best movies that came out in just in the year that it came out. I think it was 2019. So maybe that was earlier this year, actually. I don't fully remember. No, I think it was 2019. So, like, yeah, I think it was definitely one of the better movies, at least that better theatrical releases that happened.
When it came to Infinity Wars, from what I understand, it was mostly memes that propelled it forward. But I saw memes about that movie fucking everywhere. I don't even know. I've never watched it. I don't know what it's about. But
so,
I mean, I remember the
reason for that, though, is it's basically the closing chapter. Well, Endgame was the closing chapter of a cinematic universe that had been in development for, like, since the very first Iron Man movie in, like, 2008 or something. I want to say it was like 2008, 2009, because I think they have an Obama reference, but I don't fully remember. So yeah, like, that's shit where it's like you're dealing with that makes sense for hype. Like, that's a maybe not once in a lifetime, but like once every 10 or 20 years thing that will happen where it's like there's this giant cinematic universe series of movies. It would be like if they announced that the final Call of Duty game was coming out or something. Like, that's sort of what I would have an allegory to. It's like, oh,
that's
this is the final one.
Actually.
Yeah. So it's a bit more understandable there. It's a bit more neat.
The way you're explaining it basically means that the movies I mentioned basically have a good reason for the hype, whereas many games don't, essentially. That's really the key difference. So even though movies are hyped, they're hyped for better reasons, at least in these cases.
Well, maybe you can at least trace back the explanation. Whereas I guess Cyberpunk 2077 is hyped because Keanu Reeves was in a trailer, and no, I can't think of any other reason.
Maybe for The Witcher 3, which is a popular game on its own, to be fair. Like, many people play that, and I guess they want to play the sci-fi version of it. I don't know.
Yeah.
I imagine that's a big reason for the appeal.
Yeah, maybe. But just because you've succeeded in winning people over with an RPG game set in fantasy doesn't... I don't even know if Cyberpunk 2077 is supposed to be an RPG. I can't really tell. Like they seem to be marketing it as, but it's an FPS instead. So a completely different series of mechanics.
It's like a mix of the two.
Yeah.
Where you need to have skills that you need to upgrade and shit like that. Yeah. And by the way, regarding stories, there is one last thing I wanted to show you. You can post this in the description as well. Okay. So this is from a review of a Brazilian TV series called City of Men. And the second paragraph in particular, it talks about, for example, how the director tries to keep things moving fast, so we don't have time to think about plot holes and contrivances. Mm-hmm. I think that's on one hand, I feel like movie critics are a lot more mature than game critics are. Like, can you imagine a game critic like from IGN or whatever writing something like this about a game? Like, I don't think that happens. I mean, I'm no expert, but I haven't really seen this style of criticism regarding a game from major gaming review websites. Like, they just try to be very, very diplomatic about it, let's say.
Oh, well, the other issue with actual game reviewers and stuff is a lot of the times they are bought out, or like if not by actual money, it's more like implementation of it's like the idea is we get free review copies and some press and like invites to their events and stuff, which drives our business. And if we review their games negatively, they'll start blackballing us. Like this actually happens even to YouTube reviewers. Like if the YouTube reviewers review a game poorly, they probably will not get review copies of games in the future. And publications get review copies even of like new consoles and stuff. And like there was some really weird recent controversy where some woman said that because she was black and a woman, and that there weren't that many black female reviewers reviewing the PS5, she should get a free PS5, and she stirred up enough of a shitstorm to get a free PS5 from Sony. So like, it's weird shit like that. Like that's essentially, I think that's an area where you can see that there's the credibility of this shit isn't where it should be. And I'm not sure that film reviewers are any better off, but it seems like they are based on what I've seen. So
yeah, I mean, like that was a scam that worked. She got a fucking PS5 for free.
Yeah,
I mean,
pretty good.
Holy shit! But yeah, like regarding this thing about the plot holes and contrivances, I think that's really, again, to tie in with the symbolism stuff. I think that's basically what games adopt movie elements for, to basically distract from the fact that the story is poor and the gameplay oftentimes is lackluster. So they have the cinematic symbolism, like the superficial cinematic aspects, layered on top of it all in order to make it seem more, in order to make it seem better, in order to make it seem more coherent, in order to make it seem more polished and professional, even though ultimately it's just layers of mediocrity on top of each other. I think that's the driving point behind this.
Oh yeah, well, like
it happens in movies as well, of course. But
an angle that I can take on this is like I remember there's a later stage of Dead Space 2, and in that game you have to like basically be standing very, very still. Like you can be moving, but you move really slowly if you're also aiming, and you have to aim in order to shoot. You can't hip fire. So in that game, you're basically stuck moving incredibly slowly if you are moving at all during shooting, and as a result of that, you're encouraged to start and stop every time you need to start shooting somebody. And so you're not really encouraged to be moving around very much at all when you're actually in combat. But there's a sequence towards the end of the game where everything is designed to like propel you forwards. Like there's an enemy that you can't kill. You can only like slow them down. And there's a bunch of them and they're chasing you. And then there's like normal enemies that you can kill normally. But Like, why would you be stopping at any point for this? So, like, the game's mechanics are actually fighting each other in this particular example, where, like, the default way that you've been shooting and killing enemies this whole time suddenly doesn't work because of a gimmick enemy, and isn't really the right way to do it anyway because of other gimmicks thrown in. And so you're encouraged to just keep running instead of actually stopping to fight. And that's an example where it's like, if we just keep the player moving, then maybe they won't notice all of this, how hollow things are or how bad things are. And the same is true for like post-processing. If we stop the player from actually seeing details, they won't notice how bad those details are. The same is true for, in my opinion, it's like dialogue that I referenced earlier. If we keep distracting the player with dialogue and we don't give them any time to think, they won't be able to think about how stupid things are or how boring things are or whatever. You know what I mean? So
yeah,
I think that at that point, the sensory overload angle is more common in video games, but it's a similar manifestation of trying to hide the incompetence. So I think something like that, like what you described, what this sort of screenshot of the review implies as well, is a similar thing. So yeah. I think it's a reasonable point to make that a lot of the times this happens in video games. I would say most video games suffer from this problem of, like, in one way or another. It might not be through pacing. It might not be through like forcing the player to constantly move. But when you ever are able to pierce the veil and really start to think about what's happening or really analyze what's happening, it's usually underwhelming at that point. And I think a lot of games have just tried to make it so that you can't do that.
Yep, that's definitely true, unfortunately. And another bullet point, pretty much, like another thing that is a valid form of criticism. So game developers should learn from this. And like I said, with the plot twist stuff, if they actually focus on making better characters instead of plot twists, they could improve their game. The same thing here, if they actually focused on having their elements of the game be more coherent and more engaging, then they would not have to rely so much on cinematic aspects or stuff like that.
Oh yeah, as a bit of a closing point, one of the main things that I would encourage people to do is, like, don't rely on weird gimmicks and shit like that. Just like try to do, again, one of the reasons why I encourage people to do linear stuff that's like more straightforward and be more reserved with the crazier or wackier elements of a plot or of a game is, like, if you can just isolate things down to the core mechanics, really what like defines your game or what defines your movie or whatever, you're going to have a better time, precisely because it's a lot of work to implement all of these like workaround shit, like the excess dialogue for distracting the player. That's a lot of voice actor time. That's a lot of script writing time. Mm-hmm. You know, that's a poor allocation of your resources if you can just engage the player with the game. And the same is true for like when you're dealing with post-processing and stuff. Like, it's actually less work. After a certain point, it's less work to just create a simpler but more functional and more visually consistent scene than it is to layer all of these shitty effects into your shaders and stuff. And I would say the same is true for stuff like basically in gaming, shortcuts have turned into things that actually take more effort to implement. And the reason for the shortcut initially is to not do as much work and to cut corners in some way. Whereas you're actually like signing yourself up for a more like a worse product, but with none of the upside of doing that. You don't have any of the upside of like actually reducing the workload. You're just like learning all the wrong reasons, all the wrong lessons. So I would just in general like focus on that idea. Is like game developers can actually make better products with less time and effort and resources invested in those products if they just like have their process figured out a little bit better and if they focus on the right things, basically.
Yeah, that's a very good point. How shortcuts have basically turned into objectives, which is not a very good approach, as you've just stated. And yeah, I think that's a really good closing point for the whole argument. But there is actually one more aspect I would like to discuss on this podcast, which is, actually a game. You mentioned that you play HunCraft. I actually have no idea what that is. So what is that about?
That is a custom campaign expansion pack for Brood War created by a bunch of Hungarians in 2001. It's for a very old version of the game, and it has cutscenes. It has some other stuff. So it's actually a fully stocked. Recently, it was translated by Kokolol, who is a community member, not of the Discord server, but he showed up on the stream when I was streaming it. Now, unfortunately, I couldn't get mouse lock to work, so every time I moved my mouse to the left, it would pop off onto my other monitor and minimize the game. I couldn't get windowed mode to work either because it's an older version of the game. So that kind of sucked. But I will say that in general, if you're not worrying about that, if you only have one monitor setup or whatever, you can set up the product. The problem is, this was not a very pleasant experience. The story was fucking batshit crazy. So like, all of the criticisms that we've provided for games up until this point were very let's just say it was it's like they didn't even get to the level of bad that Dead Space's story was, or something like that. Like it was just constant twists and constant like ass pulls and like.
At this point, I have to ask: is it more like, I don't know, Retribution, or is it more like Legacy of the Confederation, both in story and gameplay?
Well, there was a micro mission as the second map of the entire campaign, but for the most part, it seemed like it was macro, so it was a bit more like Retribution. The problem is, it was so heavily gimmicked. Like from the very first mission, you had like battle cruisers and wraiths just be spawned at you. And there was no way to intuit that that's what was going to happen. It's like
the insurrection mission where you have fucking Marines spawning from barracks in the space platform. I don't know if you remember that.
Yeah, I do. Except in this case, they just spawn off map, like not off map, but like on the corners or whatever. There's also a lot of cutscenes where they're just like creating units in front of you. Like they deliberately center view you to a place, and then they create the unit afterwards, which is like really jarring. And they've it also has original characters. It has Kerrigan, it has Raynor, who gets infested, I think, and then it has Mengsk. It has not Dagall because he died. I don't know. There's some other. There's Cerebrit Gizorn, Gzorn. Now there's a Cerebrit whose name is Gorn, but that's not this Cerebrit. This Cerebrit is a different guy named Gizorn. You know, my Gorn and his brother Gizorn. So yeah, I thought that was fucking psychotic. So yeah, the mission design left a lot to be desired and was pretty malicious. There's a ton of inaccessible mineral fields that basically meant that your ability to get an economy rolling was really hampered. There was this one mission where a really lengthy cutscene that has invulnerable Terran units wiping out an enemy Terran base, which just looked so embarrassing and so stupid. It was like Babby's first fucking cutscene. And so that happened, and it was really long. It took like, I want to say it took like 2 or 3 minutes, and that doesn't sound like a long time, but it's a long time watching invulnerable units kill stuff. And then after that, like they didn't even finish killing stuff. They just, after a certain amount of time, everything else just detonated with no context. So that was pretty epic. And then the units got back into the transports very slowly, and then the transports flew off, and then you arrive with some Zerg stuff, because it's a Zerg campaign, and a bunch of overlords unload some units, and then the overlords fly off. So you've got to build your base up, and you've got like 20 supply or something of units that is just sitting there. You only get 4 drones or 6 drones or something. And then, no, I think it was 4. You get 4 drones, 2 Ultralisks, and a bunch of Hydras. And like, okay, so you've got all this supply, but the overlords didn't stay. So you don't have overlords. Like, you have to build overlords from nothing. You literally build up from nothing. It's psychotic. So like, as soon as that happened, I knew I was in for a doozy. And I persevered as long as I could, but then I got killed by spawn battlecruisers in the next mission, so I said, fuck that. So yeah, it's...
so you only played 2 missions in the end?
No, I played 5, I think. That was that psychotic mission that I was just talking about was the 4th, and then spawn battlecruisers killed... you have 4 hives, and if any of them die, you lose. Also, if you build another hive and that dies, you lose, because if you have any deaths of a hive, you lose. So... I mean, I don't think you wouldn't ever need to build another hive, but it's not even like you can stay alive if you have at least 4 hives or something. It's just stupid. So yeah, the battle cruisers come in and, pretty embarrassing stuff. So the fact that they just spawned wave after wave of shit instead of giving you an AI to fight, pretty embarrassing. So while there's some technical elements to it, it's like, oh, they have cutscenes and they have all this other stuff. I didn't even actually get to see any cutscenes, but they have like custom... They have a couple custom portraits and a couple of custom like character models and stuff. And
are they useful for either, or do they look too terrible?
Some of the portraits might be usable, but they're definitely a downgrade from I
guess placeholders.
The vanilla, yeah. And I would say also like they have a couple of custom units, but they're not very interesting whatsoever. Like there's a Hydralisk morph that morphs into the Scantolisk, and it's a scorpion that basically acts as a mobile spore colony. But like that's boring as fuck. Like why would you just have a version of the spore colony that can walk at that point? You know what I mean? So it also doesn't look very good, so it can't even really be repurposed for anything else, I don't think. But so there's a bunch of complaints that I have about it. At the end of the day, it was more of a spectacle to check off the list as opposed to trying to actually play to completion. It was the last high-profile StarCraft custom content that I hadn't already played, so I figured it was warranted a run now that it was translated to English, because again, it was originally only in Hungarian. And I mean, at least I was able to experience it, although I wish I hadn't. So there you go. That's HunCraft.
Yeah. Holy shit. I'll probably have to check out the videos at some point. That sounds like a mental illness trip for sure. Like the mentally ill character was the player all along because of the campaign, as we were discussing earlier from Dead Space.
I think it's definitely a mentally ill campaign. Like if you just like read the dialogue, because you have to read the translation, because it's obviously not like voice acted translated, it's just subtitled as opposed to being revoiced. Because of that, it's if you just read the voice acting, it's pretty embarrassing. So I can leave it at that as a bit of a teaser. That's pretty much it. And that's HunCraft for you. So yeah, unless you got any other final points or thoughts, we could probably close it out there.
Yeah, I think that's enough for this podcast. We'll see again, like you said, we'll see about the Cyberpunk stuff and other games in the future. But you guys should definitely go watch HunCraft and declare war on Hungary, I guess.
Yeah, declare war on Hungary. The other alternate title of this particular podcast episode. So
I also like how I just checked it that they have a page on the StarCraft wiki for whatever reason, and I like how they have a fucking Hungarian flag on the spaceship. Like, that's amazing.
Yeah, dude. Hungarian pride, baby.